Good morning, everyone. It's nice to be back amongst you again. I hope you've had a bit of a break over the Christmas New Year period and looking forward to a good year ahead. You might find the reading and maybe the choice of topic a bit strange. You probably couldn't find a culture much more different to today's than what we've just read. And it has quite a few challenges for us, but I think it has a great deal for us to learn. I've particularly increased in my interest in particularly Genesis recently because I've learnt that the Old Testament teaches us in very different ways than what I'm particularly more familiar with, which is shown in the way Paul teaches. Like Paul, when he writes, says, this is what I want you to believe, and this is why, and he explains it all, and it's very clear-cut. But Genesis reads almost like a novel. So it's different for me, I guess, to recognise that it is just as much a powerful way of teaching as Paul's way in the New Testament. And I think this chapter has a lot for us to learn. So, Abram and his family were originally polytheists in Ur, which was a major hindrance to God's intention to preserve a line of righteous people from Adam right through to Jesus. So God, as we know, called Abram out of Ur, and obviously out of polytheism, and promised him many things, such as making him a great nation and to bless him, and ultimately that all nations of the earth would be blessed through him. And he had enough faith in God to leave his family and go off in a direction that led him away from everything that he knew at the age of 75 years old, despite the fact that he was given no clear destination. When he arrived in Canaan, he actually found there was a severe famine there. Now, we don't know whether he was aware that that was where God intended him ultimately to settle, but because of the famine, he went down into Egypt. In Egypt, as some of you will know, he was a bit worried that his wife, because she was so attractive, would attract the attention and that he might be killed for the sake of his wife. So he told Sorayas, his wife, to disguise that fact, to not tell anyone. And so she ended up in the harem of the Pharaoh of the day. This is all prior to our chapter, by the way. And Pharaoh was very generous to Abram because of Sorayas, until he found out that God was inflicting illnesses and problems in his household and found out that, in fact, she was already married, and he was very angry and sent them away. Now, why do I mention that? Well, he sent him away with lots of flocks and herds and servants. And I'm pretty sure that that's where Hagar became part of Abram's household. I'm just going to grab some water. So the first big problem for God's line of righteous people was having people who didn't just trust in him. But the second major one was the fact that Sorayas, Abram's wife, couldn't have children. In fact, Sorayas said to Abram that God had prevented her from having children. And so Sorayas suggested this rather strange solution to the problem, that Hagar, her servant, would sleep with Abram and she could build a family through her. I guess that would make her a bit like a surrogate mother. Now, I probably can't relate it as well as some of you might be able to, but clearly she was in a great deal of pain to even think of such a suggestion, and probably meant that she had given up all hope of having children. It may be that, in fact, there had been no clear indication from God that Sarah, or Sorayas at that stage her name was actually going to be the mother of Abram's children. And so maybe she thought it was okay to just organise a different way for Abram to have this essential son that would allow for these many nations of descendants to arise. Now, her idea basically was that because Hagar was her property, being her slave, that any children that came from that would actually belong to her, and that way she could become a mother and build a family. That was actually quite legal and commonly done and accepted in the culture of Abram's time. Quite different to the perspective that we have. So Sarai clearly was deeply troubled by her inability to produce children, which in those times was often considered to be the primary purpose of a wife. That meant, no doubt, that she felt a failure. Failure as a woman, and it drove her to that desperate idea of how to fulfil her life and feel worthwhile as Abram's wife. Now, we need to think about whether we are any different to that now. We might like to think, well, our expectations are not like that anymore. We don't place that burden on women to feel like the only way that their life is meaningful is by having children. But I'm not sure that we really are all that different. For instance, our culture seems to be putting enormous pressure on women to look young, to look beautiful, and to be well dressed all the time. And men too have the same kinds of pressure to feel that they must excel at work, get a good job, a good income, right, and succeed. So we have expectations in in different ways, but we still have this kind of expectation on people. And we feel this need to do something to make ourselves feel like our life has been worthwhile. Young people, for example, tend to copy those who they are hanging out with because they want to be cool like everybody else and not be different. So at all ages we feel this pressure to be acceptable to society and also to God. Another example is the way people portray themselves on Facebook. You always see them at their best. You don't see the true picture of people's lives. So nobody and no society is free of these pressures to measure up in some way. I think, to be honest, deep down, most of us feel that we're just never good enough. So, really, it wasn't just Hagar that was a slave. Sarai was a slave to her disappointments and the expectations of her having to produce a child. What are you a slave to? It's a really important question. Almost inevitably, most of us have something that we work on, often subconsciously, to try and make ourselves feel acceptable and worthwhile. For many, it's building up a reputation. To be honest, there are plenty of Bible teachers who are slaves to giving such great talks that people look up to them and make them feel good about what they're doing. We can become a slave to anything. We can be a slave to seeking wealth, all kinds of things. And the only way really to begin to escape that slavery is to actually recognise what it is that we're enslaved to. And then we need to pray about it and talk to God about it and ask Him to help us break free from this need for the control of this goal of what we need to do to feel worthwhile. We need to trust God to set us free. In fact, the only way ultimately to be free of this pressure is to know that we are absolutely secure in God Himself. He accepts us and works in our lives as soon as we look to him, regardless of any merit on our part. We don't have to live up to certain standards or expectations. We can turn to him and he will always accept us. He demonstrated the value he places on each one of us by giving us his Son as a sacrifice for us while we were without any merit whatsoever. And he gives us unconditional love. His approval is actually all that we need, and that's one of the most fundamental lessons we need to learn in life, to break us free from this tendency to be enslaved to our goals. Well, one of the weirdest things, or not weird I suppose, just surprising things, is that Abram did what Sarai told him. I think he should have given it a bit more thought. The wording that is used in the Bible there is the same words as what God says to Adam, criticising him for just doing what his wife suggested in the Garden of Eden. Why was it so wrong? Well, it wasn't God's plan. He hadn't spent time talking to God and saying, here's the suggestion of Sarai. Should I do this? Is it right? Is it okay? He didn't pray to God that God would fix the problem that kept Sarai from having a child. And I actually suspect that he learned that lesson because we learned that his son, that came ultimately later when Sarai did have children, that son Isaac had to pray for his wife who couldn't have children either initially. And I suspect that in fact he learned his lesson and said, don't repeat my mistake. You make sure that if you have this problem, you take that to God. The big thing about it is that he accepted a human solution. Unfortunately, that human solution has lasting consequences because Ishmael was a major part of the whole tribes of Arabs that exist now, and they have been constantly fighting with Israel ever since. So we've had millennia of trouble caused by one poor decision on Abram's part. As children of God, we should go to God with all of our concerns and ask for his guidance as to how we should deal with them, seeking what it says in Scripture and giving God time to teach us the best way to deal with things. Perhaps Abram was just too impatient to receive the promised child. If Sarah was barren, that meant it would require a miracle for him to have a son. But using Hagar was a human solution that didn't require God's intervention. It seems quite often that God actually wants to prove that it is his work, a miracle, that actually made this possible. There are numerous examples, just to name a few. Isaac, Jacob, Samuel, John the Baptist and Jesus himself all came through miracles. People who were not expecting to have children had children through what God did. And that idea actually got followed up by Paul in Galatians chapter 4. He actually used it as an illustration that we are not to do what is natural to become acceptable to God, which in other words is by doing all that God tells us to do. And instead, we are to look to the promise of what he does in us. Now, that might seem really strange. How can it be wrong for us to expect God to accept us by doing what he asks of us? I'm not inferring that it's wrong to do what God asks of us. But Paul is making the point we should not think that that in any way makes it us acceptable with God. He chooses us and he works in us and transforms us, and it's his work that makes us acceptable to God. He makes us more like Christ. But it's a gift that he gives us, not because we deserve it, because we've been working hard, trying to do good things, acting religious, or any of those things. We are to be born in a miraculous way with the new birth that he provides, regardless of our merit. So Paul was contrasting human effort to please God with the grace of God in making us his children and transforming us to be like Christ. Well, Abram did what Sorayas suggested, and Hagar became pregnant. But she no longer felt like a worthless slave anymore. She now felt like someone with significance, as the one who would produce a child for Abram. And Hagar, unfortunately, then despised Sarai. She may have actually considered herself to be the more important wife, having done something that Sarai could not do. And Sarai's response is not surprising. She accused Abram of causing this response of Hagar. In fact, she seems to be inferring that Hagar's attitude was Abram's fault. She may have been accusing Abram of giving Hagar reason to feel more important than her. In fact, Sarai asked God to judge between her and Abram, inferring basically that God ought to punish him. Now, at least a part of this was the pain that she was experiencing, because instead of making things better, her idea had made things a lot worse. She probably felt that she'd been replaced as a wife and afraid for her future. Things were worse, not better. Abram's response is very regrettable. Abram responded to Sarai's comments by saying that Hagar was still her servant. She still owned her, and she was therefore under Sarai's authority. In fact, Abram said she could do to Hagar whatever she thought was appropriate. Now, I think this was a very cowardly response, and it didn't really consider the needs and implications at all, particularly not for Hagar or Sarai herself. Always when we're facing difficulties, it's easy to respond quickly without thought and do a lot of damage. So it's important for us to pray about these difficulties that we have and ask God for guidance on how to deal with them, rather than having a knee-jerk reaction. We need to take to God our fears, our troubles, our pain, and especially our decisions. Sarai, the record says, treated Hagar harshly. The word harshly there is actually the same word that is used by the Egyptians' treatment of Israel in Egypt. In other words, put very simply, it's almost certain that Sarai had Hagar beaten. She was property. Sarai was allowed to do what she wanted with her. And not surprisingly, Hagar chose to run away to avoid that pain and trouble because Sarai was so cruel. Hagar is actually a Hebrew name. The word Hagar means stranger. And I think now she more than ever before felt like a stranger. She ran away. She had nobody to turn to, no place to go to. She was away alone with very little food and water. She was in dire straits. She had probably very little chance of surviving. She may have had a little knowledge of the area, but she was probably lost with no idea of where to go or what to do. The reference to Shur that was in the record there probably means that she was running into the Arabian wilderness, and things would probably have seemed hopeless. But even though Sarai and Abraham seem not to have cared for Hagar, God did. God always cares for strangers and those who are alone and unsupported. So God sent an angel to Hagar, finding her near a spring of water. And he addressed Hagar as the servant of Sarai and asked her where she's come from and where she's going. And she's honest and just admits that she's running away from Sarai, her mistress. But the angel told her that she should return to Sarai and submit to her. That would have been enormously difficult for her. But the whole experience that she has now made it possible for her to feel that she mattered and that she was going back as a different woman. Not just mattering to Abram, but also that she mattered to God. It was necessary for her to go back to enable her to survive so that God could bless her as he promised. But she now knew that God was watching over her and taking care of her needs. She now had to learn obedience by what she suffered, just as Christ did in Hebrews 5 verse 8, and how we should learn. The angel promised her that she would have many descendants, too numerous to count. She was going to have a son, and she was to call him Ishmael, which means God hears. And that was because God heard Hagar's painful groans. What a nice reminder. Every time she called her son in the future, she would be reminded that God had heard her when she needed it the most. God said her son would be like a wild donkey, which we tend to take as a very negative thing, but apparently it just means that he would be a solitary man living out there roaming the world. But he was also going to be in hostility to everyone as they would be to him, and certainly that seems to have been historically the case. It's fascinating what you read about the angel there. The angel is not identified as an angel, but rather as the angel of the Lord. In verse 10, the angel says, I will greatly multiply your descendants, not God will greatly multiply your descendants. And so in verse 10 of that story, Hagar says, I've seen the one who sees me. She's not scared of the angel, as most other people are when they are faced with an angel, because normally the glory of the angel is terrifying. But she says, actually, in verse 13, have I even remained alive here after seeing him? She actually assumed that she was talking directly to God himself. So Hagar gave God the name, the God who sees me, because she had seen the one who had seen her. And that's what gave her the confidence to go back and return to Sarai, even though she would still find it very difficult to work for someone who had been so cruel to her. But she no longer felt like an unimportant stranger that mattered to no one, because she knew God cared for her. She had the assurance that nothing could happen to her that God wouldn't see, because she now knew that God heard her cries and saw her need. God wasn't just caring for the Israelites. He cares for all of those who turn to him in their need. He sees us in our times of pain, our dark times, because he cares. Hagar returned and gave birth to a son to Abraham, who was now 86 years old. Abraham named him Ishmael, which immediately, I think, tells us that when Hagar told the whole story of her experience with the angel, that he accepted that and did as the angel said. So he, in fact, gave the name that God said he should have. He believed Hagar. Hagar's experience actually foreshadowed Israel's future, except that the positions were later reversed. She was an Egyptian who was mistreated by her Hebrew master and fled into the wilderness. The Hebrews were slaves in Egypt and fled to the wilderness. In each case, God heard their cries and saw their need and intervened to help them and protect them. And I guess the most important lesson I want you to take away from this morning is that God is the God who sees. No matter what you're going through, he sees your trials, your difficulties, and he hears your cries. We should always turn to him in our need. God said, "I have seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt." Hagar's name, as I said, means stranger, and God, in fact, would require the Israelites in their new land to love the strangers who came among them, because they were supposed to remember that they too had been slaves in Egypt. When we go through troubles and experience the pain and come across others who have the same thing, we have a greater opportunity to share empathy with those people and care for them. And we are to do that based on our experiences. 3 religions, Judaism, Islam and Christianity, all revere Abraham as the hero of faith. Many people have a problem, though, with this story because Abram and Sarai are not wonderful examples that we should copy. I believe this is because many people misunderstand the Bible and the purpose of God. You see, in times past, the people who wanted to teach their children would write stories of their heroes and show all of the wonderful qualities that they have and tell their children that that's what they should copy. But the Bible is not like that. The Bible is a record of what God is doing. It's not a record of all the good things human beings do. In fact, we have lots of examples where we are embarrassed to read about what they have done. People we revere, like Abram, Isaac, Jacob, Moses and David, all have some terrible things recorded of them that they did. But they're not there for us to learn that we should be like them. We are to actually learn to depend on God as they did. Because we are not made more acceptable to God simply by doing right things. We're acceptable to God because he chooses us, not because we choose him. Christianity is not about learning the right way to live like all other religions. All other religions say, here are the steps you have to go through. These are the standards you have to live by, and if you live up to those, then you will be rewarded. No, the gospel says if you turn to God, you will be accepted, even with no merit whatsoever, and he will make you acceptable through the sacrifice of his Son and the transforming work he does in our lives. The Bible shows God relating to people who didn't always rise above the insensitivity and injustices of their culture. It's a book actually that shows the weaknesses and failures of our most revered leaders. So the Bible is about what God can do, not about what humans must do, and about how he transforms us. God made an eternal covenant with Abram while his faith was still very weak and just still growing. And yet, right from the very beginning, Abram was accepted as righteous forever. So the gospel is about what God does for us, not about what we do for him. Jesus said, "I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." And just I want to read for you from Romans chapter 5 that emphasises this. "For while we were still weak, at the right time Christ died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would even dare to die. But God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." "Since therefore we have now been justified by his blood, how much more shall we be saved by him from the wrath of God? For if while we were enemies we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son, how much more now that we are reconciled shall we be saved by his life? More than that, we also rejoice in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we now have received reconciliation." So the gospel is not about what we do to please God, but about what he has done for us in Christ, what he is doing in us, providing forgiveness for us and enabling us to become more like Christ. So, a quick recap. 4 key points, the major points to remember from this story. Always go to God. God always hears. God always sees. God always cares. Peter's now going to play us a song that will emphasise this for us to remember.